Reimagining the world. Justice starts by recognizing and properly maintaining the relationships that exist between us. Notice the quote from Thomas Aquinas: "Justice is the habit whereby a person with lasting and constant will renders to each their due." Its characterization of justice offered by Sandel is striking. Unlike Sandel, Aquinas is focusing on justice as a virtue possessed by individuals rather than a characteristic of societies. Still, the connection between a just person and a just society is clear. Aquinas is concerned with the claims that others have on us. That is to say, for Aquinas, justice is a matter of duties of solidarity. The common good starts with recognizing that others have claims upon us. Within Catholic theology, God has a claim upon us, and that claim extends to all creatures, or as an ancient colleague put it, to love God above all things and in all things. Rather than seeing justice first and foremost in terms of those rights that secure individual liberty, justice should be seen in terms of recognizing and addressing the needs of those around us. Human beings are meant for happiness, but part of what it is to be human is to work towards the happiness of others. Justice, therefore, is a response to the needs each of us have to be happy and to know wherein happiness lies. Recall from the past couple of sessions that eudaimonia is not fixed. So, one demand of justice is that we are each responsible for assisting others in appropriating an understanding of eudaimonia. Catholic social teaching recognizes justice as three types or modes: communitive, distributive, and contributive. Communitive justice is that justice which exists between persons. It is about each person treating the other fairly. Like Rawls and libertarianism, communitive justice regulates agreements and contracts between parties. The difference here is that justice demands that we look after the needs of the other rather than protecting our property or interest. Distributive justice focuses on the role of the polis to secure the common good. This would include the necessities of life and those things that make for a meaningful existence, regardless of whether one can contribute to society or not. The very young, the very old, the disabled, and so on have a right to that which is the common good, because that is what is needed for human existence. One's rights, then, follow from what is needed to be human. Since rights are not based on ownership, one cannot simply do what one may wish with what one owns and call it justice. The polis has a duty to secure the common good for all. Extremes of wealth and poverty would not be allowed. If one limited Rawls' idea of justice as fairness to the common good, the difference principle might even be seen as appropriate. Distributed justice leads into the third idea of justice, namely contributive justice. While distributed justice looks at the responsibility of the polis to distribute goods, contributive justice is what individuals owe the polis in order to maintain the common good. A more contemporary name for contributive justice is social justice. It is the responsibility of individuals to create institutions and systems that maintain and expand the resources available for the common good. Contributive justice makes the requirements of distributive justice possible. Justice within Catholic moral theology starts with the idea that because all things were created by God and are declared to be good, all things have intrinsic value. Human beings in particular are said to be created in the image of God. Aspects such as wealth, social status, race, ethnicity, sexual preference, gender identity, and so on would be secondary. A just society is one where each human being is treated with equal dignity and care. Consequently, any society that distributes what we value based on these secondary aspects would be seen as unjust. Notice also that an unjust society can perpetuate itself and create a privileged class that is all but unaware of those they marginalize. This act of marginalization, however, obscures the fact that eudaimonia requires a polis dedicated to the development of the fullness of human character. We are dependent on one another. If we are dependent on each other, we are therefore also responsible for each other. Again, think back to Sandel and the duties of solidarity. Religions typically draw their moral teachings from their scriptures. Christianity is no different. Protestants have historically cited the Bible as the final rule for faith and practice. And while Catholicism also relies heavily on church tradition, tradition and scripture are closely tied to each other. The Bible, however, is not a philosophical tome on moral philosophy. What one mostly encounters are either stories or instructions drawn from those stories. There isn't as much of a systematic philosophical program or self-help guidance to be found. So, it should not be much of a surprise that Catholic moral teaching is derived from the stories that are found in the Bible. Recall Frankana's criticism of virtue theory, that we admired the characters in stories, such as those found in Shakespeare, but these characters provided no guidance about right action. Wadell would counter that the stories themselves are illustrative of a version of eudaimonia, so that from these stories we get a glimpse of what the common good should look like. So, here are some themes that come up in the Bible. First, God sides with the poor. It doesn't matter whether one is looking at the parables of Jesus, such as Lazarus and the rich man, or King Ahab and Naboth. God sides with the plight of the poor. Second, justice is weighed by our treatment of the marginalized. You can see this from the start with Israel being delivered from bondage in Egypt. Deuteronomy states that God delivered Israel not because it was a great nation, but because it was the least of nations. It is a story of deliverance from oppression. Justice, then, is the application of the common good for all people. If the stories of the Bible point to this ideal of what God holds to be just, then those who claim to know God must embody this perspective. Think of friendship for a moment. One thing that tends to bind friends are common interest and a common perspective. To say that one is God's friend, then, is to commit oneself to God's perspective of justice. Also remember that virtue theory demands that one practice virtue. As such, it is not enough to agree with God, but to strive for the ideal of justice found in the story that elucidates that divine perspective. Notice how this changes the idea of wealth. What the stories in the Bible suggest is that we look not at what is ours or even what we can afford to give, but what good we can do with what we have. Please note, however, what we can afford to give and what good we can do with what we have are closely linked to each other. Justice requires a fair share of prudence. Simply giving everything away does not necessarily result in doing the most good. However, it does mean that our first question when it comes to justice is what good we can do. Only after that would we ask what we must give in order to achieve that good. Let's switch gears a bit. It is one thing to talk about the ideals of justice, but how does one deal justly in the face of injustice? One contribution that Christianity has made in this area is something called just war theory. Justice would presume peace, and within the Christian tradition, peace is not simply the absence of hostilities. Any peace worth the name must be a peace characterized by the outline of justice described above. Justice is a matter of being in right relation with God and each other, so that we give each other our own due. War is almost certainly, by definition, unjust. So how can any war be called just? Under what conditions could a war be waged in the interest of peace? First proposed by Augustine of Hippo in the 4th century, the aim of just war theory is to reestablish justice and peace between belligerent parties. And this requires the following: a just cause. If the idea of war is to end hostilities and reestablish a just relationship between belligerent parties, then the cause of war had to be limited to that goal. Territorial or economic expansion, subduing an opponent or ideology, or national glory would not be considered a just cause in engaging in war. Competent authority. This would be some person or some governing body charged with maintaining justice. Wadell wonders whether any recent war can be justified with this criteria, because while competent authorities formally exist, their aim in authorizing hostilities conforms with this criteria first mentioned would be seen as questionable last resort. That is, when every measure short of armed conflict has been exhausted. How does one know what the absolute last attempt has been made, and when attempts at peaceful resolution simply slide into appeasement? The rule of thumb would be that the evil of war is less than the evil of continuing with the status quo. What would almost certainly be ruled out would be the idea of a preventative war, comparative justice. This is the simple admission that conflicts are rarely clear-cut. Often, each side in a potential conflict has been injured prior to open hostilities. Again, one must refer back to the idea of a just cause and last resort to determine whether the injury done justifies a warlike response. Proportionality. If the aim of war is the restoration of justice and peace, one is required to inflict only as much force as is required to meet that end, and only as much as the initial corresponding injury. It also means that non-combatants be kept out of harm's way. Given that modern warfare is often a matter of attrition, while this requirement is something that can be calculated, war is often something that inflicts greater harm than the initial injury. Right intention. One must always ask whether the justification for going to war is the actual reason and not simply a pretense. Likelihood of success. Justice demands prudence. Even if one's cause is just and all other means have been exhausted, it is important to weigh the injustice that would result if defeated by an unjust combatant. If there's little chance of success in a conflict, then an unjust peace without war is better than an unjust peace at the conclusion of such a war. And finally, a just peace. Recall that war can only be justified as the last available means of re-establishing justice. Any peace agreed to must have reconciliation as its goal.